Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Brusatte. I am a paleontologist at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm very excited and very happy to be giving a lecture for you for the series. I've been a long time admirer of everything that Steve has done and collected, and we've worked together on some team studying marine reptiles. So I'm very pleased to be able to give this talk, but I'm going to talk about something that's maybe a little bit different outside the normal Steve Etches universe, and that's mammals. And so a few years ago, I wrote a book, a pop science book called The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs. And primarily, that's what I do. I study dinosaurs. That's how I started my career. Most of the work that I've done in my career is all about dinosaurs. And I do this at the University of Edinburgh now. I'm a professor in Edinburgh. I've been there for about a decade. I didn't grow up here, but I grew up in the middle part of America and made my way to Edinburgh and settled in here and love living here, working here, teaching amazing students. And we have a great paleontology program in Edinburgh. And a lot of the work I've done has been dinosaur-based. But the more I've studied dinosaurs, the more I've become interested in what happened after the dinosaurs. And that brings us to mammals. And so mammals are the topic of my new book. My new adult pop science book is called The Rise and Reign of the Mammals. In some ways, it's a follow-up to The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, but really it's a different beast altogether. It goes all the way back to 325 million years ago and tells the whole story of how the mammal line emerged and evolved and produced the mammal species today, culminating, of course, with us and the 6,000 other species of mammals that are our closest cousins, from our pet dogs and cats to bats and whales and elephants and monkeys and rabbits and rodents and everything else. Now, we all know the classic story of the dinosaurs dying. The asteroid came down 66 million years ago. It drew a curtain on the Cretaceous, the end of the age of dinosaurs. And from that, mammals emerged victorious. That's the story that's often told. And the broad brush outline of that story is correct. But I think there is a misconception that often sneaks its way into textbooks and museum exhibits and how we think about mammals. And that is this idea that the dinosaurs died and then the mammals evolved to take their place. Now, undoubtedly, the mammals did start to take the place of dinosaurs after the extinction. They grew in size, they filled many ecological roles that were once held by dinosaurs, but the history of mammals goes way, way, way back, even before the dinosaurs. So mammals did not evolve because the dinosaurs died. Mammals evolved much earlier, and they took advantage of when the dinosaurs died. And so I want to tell you that story here. And I'm going to do it quickly because we don't have a huge amount of time. I'm going to try to do about 325 million years of evolution in 45, 50 minutes or so. And so rather than waffle on, let's just go all the way back to the world of the Carboniferous, when the Earth looked like this. And much of the tropics and subtropics at this time were covered by coal swamps. These were the first big, dense jungles in Earth history. There were trees that stretched 100 feet into the canopy, primitive trees, not the trees that we know of today. And it was these trees that, when they were died and buried, turned into so much of the coal that we mine here in the UK, that we mine back home in the middle part of America. And in these jungles, there was so much oxygen in the air that there were dragonflies the size of pigeons. There were millipedes that were bigger than humans. This was a time when insects and other invertebrates were huge. But in the shadows, there was a much smaller, much more humble type of animal. Now, fossils of this Carboniferous age are plentiful where I grew up, back home in Illinois, where you find these beautiful ironstone nodules, the Mazon Creek fossils. And there's lots of plants from those jungle trees, and then there's lots of invertebrates that were living in the water, and occasionally even some small animals with bones, some tetrapods that were living on land. Now, when I was a teenager, I collected these fossils. There I am with my brothers at an old coal mine spoil pile, looking for these little ironstone nodules. I always wanted to find one of these tetrapods, one of these land-living vertebrates, because I knew that around this time in the coal swamps, something very important was happening. And that is that there was a great split in the family tree of life. the lineage that eventually would go on to produce reptiles, snakes, lizards, dinosaurs, crocodiles, birds. That line split from the line that would eventually produce mammals. There was a fork in the family tree. And that mammal line is what we call the synapsid group. So these are not true mammals yet, but these are the ancestors of mammals branching off on their own. The first good fossils that we have of these synapsids are things like Archaeopteryx here, an animal that if you glanced at it, you would probably think it's some kind of strange lizard. But there was something that set these first synapsids apart, and that is that behind their eye socket, so here's the eye socket here, behind their eye socket they had another opening, and that hole in the head held big jaw muscles. It allowed them to bite harder than other animals at the time. And this is something that mammals today, including us, retain from those distant ancestors. There's that same hole behind our eye socket, just really behind our cheekbone. So it was that one small, almost subtle little change in the anatomy that inaugurated this synapsid line. And from that point, these synapsids would continue to evolve and change and diversify as the world changed. So it was this great split in the family tree. The reptiles on one side, eventually the mammals on the other, but there are so many fossil synapsids, extinct species, things that are not quite mammals, but proto-mammals, things that were on the line to mammals, things that were evolving the features of mammals during the Carboniferous period, and then the next period of time, which is the Permian period. And the Permian is when the supercontinent of Pangaea came together. All the world's land collided together to form this one giant landmass that stretched from North Pole to South Pole. And much of this land was hot and dry and covered in deserts. It was a challenging place to live, but these synapsids were well suited for living on that world. They did not have to lay their eggs in the water like, say, frogs and salamanders do. They had those big extra jaw muscles that they could use to eat lots of different foods. So they became very important animals, very diverse animals on this Permian Pangaean world. And it is in this Permian world that we start to see some remarkable synapsids. The most famous of all is Dimetrodon. You see this animal everywhere. It has a sail on its back, very iconic. Oftentimes it's mistaken as a dinosaur, and you see it in dinosaur toy sets and on the dinosaur posters. You see it in the new Jurassic World film, as a matter of fact. It's such a kind of reptilian, dinosaurian looking beast that is right at home in the film with the T-Rexes and the raptors and so on. But it's not a dinosaur. It's not even a reptile. It is a synapsid. It has that hole for jaw muscles behind its eyes. It is on the mammal line. This animal is more closely related to us than it is to any dinosaur. And Dimetrodon was a fierce meat eater. It weighed a few hundred kilos. It was at the top of the food chain. It was one of the first pure, terrifying predators, apex predators on land in Earth history. You can see that with those teeth in its mouth. The other thing you can see with those teeth in the mouth are that those teeth don't all look the same. There's some long ones at the front of the snout. There's some really big ones a little bit farther back behind the nostril, and there's some smaller ones along the jaw. This is different from the jaws of most dinosaurs or reptiles. This is starting to look kind of like a mammal because we have so many different types of teeth, canines and incisors, premolars and molars. So you're starting to see these changes in the teeth early on in these synapsids like Dimetrodon. This is a whisper of a dental revolution yet to come. Now, these synapsids, they really were dominant in the Permian world. They lived all over the world. There were big meat eaters like Dimetrodon. There were lots of big plant eaters, too, some of the first true large-bodied, bulk-feeding plant eaters in Earth history. And they formed complex food webs. And it looked like they would go on living forever. But their reign was cut short because around 250 million years ago, these enormous volcanoes started to erupt in what is now Siberia. And these volcanoes were unlike any volcanoes humans have ever seen. These were basically fissures, canyons in the earth that opened up and spewed out lava for hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years. And that lava covered a lot of land, and it would have, you know, like a disaster movie, engulfed a lot of animals living in the vicinity. But that wasn't the real problem. The problem was as that lava came up through the earth as magma, it burned through the crust and it released so much carbon dioxide, so much methane, these potent greenhouse gases, that these gases went into the atmosphere and led to runaway global warming. And that caused a mass extinction. And not just any mass extinction, but the biggest mass extinction in Earth history, where maybe up to 95% of species died. And so many synapsids, which up until that time had been ascendant, so many synapsids were killed off by that extinction. They were almost stopped completely in their tracks, but there were some synapsids that made it through. And among those plucky survivors were some small synapsids that could burrow and hide and protect themselves. And they probably had hair over much of their bodies to keep themselves warm and regulate their body temperature. These are called the cynodonts. And one of the most famous is this one, Thrinaxodon, and its fossils become hugely abundant in the rocks of South Africa right after that extinction, and is even found inside of burrows. Here's one remarkable fossil of one of these Thrinaxodon cynodonts on the bottom, curled up in a burrow with an amphibian. They are hiding out there. They are riding out some of the worst of that environmental change. So it was being smaller and being able to hide that helped these cynodonts make it through. And they carried the torch of the synapsids through that long, dark night of prehistory. Then on the other side, that extinction ends the Permian period. The next interval of time begins. That's the Triassic period. And the Earth is healing. Imagine, you're one of these cynodonts that survived, and you emerge from your burrow, and 95% of the species are gone. This is a largely empty world you're looking out at, a world with abundant opportunities. And so many of the survivors started to stake their own claim to that world. Turtles and crocodiles and pterodactyls and so many things originated in the Triassic as the Earth was healing from that extinction. And there were two really important groups that were part of this rebirth and renewal during the Triassic. The first is the mammals. So those cynodonts that survived, like Thrinaxodon, they got smaller and they turned into what we recognize as true mammals. But there was another group that was also diversifying at that time, and these were the dinosaurs. So mammals and dinosaurs, true mammals and dinosaurs, go back to the same time and place. They have the same origin story, the supercontinent of Pangaea, about 225 million years ago in the Triassic period. And now dinosaurs and mammals, from that point on until today, their fates would be intertwined. But their fates were different. And dinosaurs were destined for grandeur. Some of them became larger than jet airplanes. Others were meat eaters the size of buses. Some of them developed feathers and wings and became birds. But mammals were relegated to the shadows. They could not get big in a world that was dominated by all of these ferocious dinosaurs. So the first mammals were tiny. And the first mammals, the first true mammals, would have looked something like this. And we recognize them as true mammals because they have the suite of features that define the mammal blueprint, the things that mammals today have that set them apart from other animals. Things like hair all over their bodies, milk to feed their babies, big brains, high intelligence, keen senses of smell and of hearing, a single bone in the lower jaw, and extra bones in the ear, which I'll show you more of in a second. These first mammals, I think if we saw them, we would recognize them as mammals. They would have looked like a little mouse or a shrew or something like that, but they were tiny. This is Morganucodon. Its fossils are quite common in these ancient cave deposits in South Wales and around Bristol in England. And look at that jawbone at the bottom there. There's one of the jawbones, and there, as a scale next to it, is a single grain of rice. So that just shows you how tiny these mammals were. The dinosaurs went big, the mammals went small. But in doing so, in going small, mammals, they had to be resilient. They had to be adaptable. And they developed so many trademark features because they were small and because they had to survive in the shadows. One of those things was simplifying their lower jaw. Dinosaurs, lizards, amphibians, they have lots of bones in their lower jaw. even though the synapsid ancestors of mammals had lots of separate bones in their lower jaw, we have one bone, we have a single bone. And that is a hallmark of mammals. Mammals simplified their jaw so all of their teeth and all of the muscles could attach to one single solid jawbone, and that allowed them to bite even stronger. It allowed them to develop teeth like the molars and premolars that we have that interlock with each other and can chew food. That's a real superpower. So mammals evolved this new type of jaw that could chew and that could bite really strongly, all powered by this single strong, solid jawbone. Now, that meant that those extra jawbones that used to be there in the lower jaw of the ancestors, what's the point of them anymore? Well, some of them disappeared, but others were repurposed, and they became tiny, and they migrated into the ear, where they started to serve a new function to transmit sound, and that allowed mammals to hear better than any other animals at the time. So all of this was happening in the shadows, and the other thing that was happening was mammal brains got bigger and bigger. And mammal senses got better and better, especially hearing and smell, because these mammals probably could come out really only or at least mostly at night, because the day was the domain of the dinosaurs. So this was all going down in the Triassic period. Mammals had to adapt in order to endure this world where the dinosaurs were getting bigger and bigger. So what were mammals really like during this time? Well, for a long time, we haven't known much. The fossil record was very limited, mostly what we had from the Triassic, and then even in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, the next intervals of the age of dinosaurs. We had lots of dinosaur fossils, but not that many mammal fossils. And most mammals, the fossils we had were teeth or little jawbones. We didn't have much else. There were, however, some amazing discoveries beginning in the 1970s up here in Scotland. And they were made in a place that I think is one of the most beautiful places in the world to find fossils, a place I go every year. I take my students there, and that's the Isle of Skye, this enchanted landscape where you have Jurassic age rocks hugging a lot of the coastline. And these rocks have dinosaur fossils and crocodile fossils and pterodactyl fossils, and they also have some mammal fossils. Now, I bring the students out pretty much every year. Our students always make the best discoveries. This is the prime example. This is Amelia Penny in the middle. Amelia was a student at the time. And when we were out prospecting a few years ago, she discovered the skeleton of a pterosaur, a pterodactyl that was poking out of the rocks on this tidal flat. And it turned out to be this gorgeous skeleton of a new species called Yarkskianak that we named, a Gallic name we gave it. We named it earlier this year. Great discovery made by a student. I love taking the students out because they have so much energy and so much enthusiasm, and they find the best fossils. But we don't only look for the big stuff. We look for the small stuff too. And here's Moji, one of our former master's students who came from Nigeria to study with us. Moji is scrutinizing the rocks with a little hand lens, looking for tiny little fossils. Fossils like the teeth and jaws of mammals, because in the 1970s, this fossil was discovered on Skye. This was one of the first skeletons of a Jurassic age mammal that had ever been found. So, tantalizing. You can find more than jaws and teeth, and we're always out there looking for skeletons. But still, there's not a huge amount from Scotland. There's bits and pieces. The real game changer came in the 1990s, and it came in China. Far up in the northeastern corner of China, in a place called Liaoning province, far off the tourist track. This province shares a long border with North Korea. It's a land of rolling hills and farmland and factories. And in the mid-90s, some of the farmers out working their land started to report some incredible fossils. And these immediately became famous. And these are the feathered dinosaurs, the first dinosaur skeletons ever found with feathers on their bodies and wings on their arms. The things that proved once and for all that today's birds evolved from dinosaurs. So these have become very famous. But the reason these feathered dinosaurs are so well preserved is because these entire ecosystems back in the Cretaceous period, about 125 million years ago, were buried by volcanic eruptions, kind of like Pompeii, when Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the town of Pompeii. And it, buried a lot of humans very sadly. Same thing happened here. It buried these animals quickly. It locked their bodies into stone. It preserved the fine detail in the fossils. And it means there's more than just dinosaurs. There's all kinds of animals there, including mammals. And so here is a photo a few years ago when I was in China with my dear colleague, Junshan Liu, who sadly passed away a few years ago. He was one of China's leading dinosaur hunters, but he also collected other fossils. And here he is showing me the skeleton of a tiny little mammal, just about the size of an apple, covered in fur, beautifully preserved by that volcanic ash. It turns out there are lots of mammals that have been found in China over the last couple of decades. And these mammal fossils tell an evocative story and an unexpected story. And that is, they tell us that during the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, for well over 100 million years, mammals were living with dinosaurs. And these mammals were tiny. They never got bigger than a badger, as far as we know. The dinosaurs were keeping them down. But although they were small, these mammals were remarkable because they evolved so many adaptations and so much diversity while living in those small niches. Among these mammals were scurriers and climbers and diggers and swimmers, even ones that had wings of skin that they used to glide between the trees. And some of them, like Repenomamus here, this is one of the biggest mammals that ever lived with the dinosaurs, about the size of a house cat. When it was buried by those volcanoes, its last meal was locked inside of its stomach, and that last meal was a baby dinosaur. So this was a mammal that ate dinosaurs. So all of this really turns the classic story on its head. Yes, there were mammals living with dinosaurs. Yes, they were in the shadows, but they were splendid at living in the shadows. They grasped those niches. They made the underworld, the undergrowth, the underground. They made that world their own. And we really need to rethink that classic story. Yes, it's true that dinosaurs kept the mammals small, but conversely, mammals kept the dinosaurs big. Mammals were so good at being small that you never saw a T-Rex the size of a mouse or a Triceratops the size of a rat. That was the world of the mammals. And that was more or less how it stayed for well over 100 million years. Now, we find some pretty neat fossils of some of these mammals now in other parts of the world. I've done some fieldwork in Romania where we literally pluck the bones of some of these Cretaceous age mammals from the riverbeds. And another dear and sadly late friend, Matthias Bremer, who passed away a few years ago from cancer, he was the best fossil collector I ever knew. And he collected these amazing fossils of some of these Cretaceous mammals in the rivers. And what these fossils show is that during the Cretaceous, while there were still dinosaurs, while mammals were still small, mammals were diversifying even more, and they were changing their teeth. Their teeth were becoming ever more complex in order to eat a new type of food that had just emerged, and these were the flowering plants. A Brontosaurus, a Stegosaurus living in the Jurassic period would have never seen a flower or a fruit. Flowering plants started to spread in the Cretaceous, and these mammals took advantage not only of the new fruits and flowers that were on offer, but also all of these new insects that were pollinating the plants. This was a veritable buffet of food for these mammals, and they diversified even more, and we see that in these fossils that we find. So by the end of the Cretaceous, the world was looking something like this. This is where things stood about 66 million years ago. And this was the time when T-Rex was still around. T-Rex was living on that slice of land at the far west of North America. Triceratops was there, all kinds of dinosaurs. And then literally one day, everything was thrown into chaos. The dinosaurs, the mammals, all the other things that were around in the Cretaceous, they had no idea, no forewarning. Just one random day, this 6-mile wide rock fell out of the sky. It was an asteroid hurtling through the cosmos on just a totally random trajectory. It could have gone anywhere, but it made a beeline for the Earth, and it smashed into what is now Mexico with the energy of over 1 billion nuclear bombs put together. It smashed a hole in the crust over 100 miles wide, and it immediately unleashed chaos. Wildfires, earthquakes, tsunamis, all kinds of disasters. And then all the dust and grime and dirt and soot went up into the atmosphere, blocked out the sun. The earth went dark and cold, maybe for up to a decade. Plants couldn't photosynthesize. They died. The forests collapsed. Plant-eating dinosaurs and other animals had no food to eat. They died. The meat eaters had no food to eat. They died. Ecosystems collapsed like houses of cards. And this was a mass extinction. and 3 out of every 4 species died. T-Rex was there, Triceratops was there, duck-billed dinosaurs, armored dinosaurs, long-necked dinosaurs, they were all there to witness this, and none of them would endure. All of these dinosaurs were gone, probably within a few 100,000 years at most. The only surviving dinosaurs were some weird, small, feathery winged ones that we call birds. But what about mammals? Well, mammals must have made it through, or else we wouldn't be here having this discussion. So we had ancestors that stared down that asteroid and somehow endured. And a big part of my research has now turned to understanding how that happened, how mammals survived the asteroid impact, and then what they did afterwards in a world now where 3 out of every 4 species is gone. So I've been spending a lot of time in New Mexico, out in Western North America. This is one of the best places in the world for finding fossils of the very last dinosaurs and the mammals that replaced them. There's beautiful Badlands topography out there, and there are so many different types of fossils. I bring my students out to New Mexico as well, and Sarah Shelley here was my very first PhD student in Edinburgh. She's now one of the handful of world's experts on those mammals that replaced the dinosaurs. And here she is with Tom Williamson, who's a dear colleague and friend of mine. He's the curator of the museum out in Albuquerque, and Tom has been collecting fossils of these mammals for like 25 years now. And he's collected thousands and thousands of them. And they are beautiful fossils. And it is a really striking thing because you walk through the Badlands of New Mexico, you're walking through the Cretaceous age rocks, you find the ground littered with dinosaur bones, busted shards of sauropod and duck-billed dinosaur bones, and then all of a sudden they stop. And then you start finding the bones and the teeth and the jaws of mammals. Now what's remarkable is, it seems like mammals almost went the way of the dinosaurs. It seems like, based on the best statistics that we have, maybe 9 out of every 10 mammals died when the asteroid hit. Only a few mammals made it through, but the ones that survived seem to be the ones that were smallest, the ones that could burrow so they could hide away, the ones that grew fast, could reproduce fast, and the ones that had a very omnivorous diet. They could eat lots of different foods. That seemed to be the winning hand of cards for these mammals, including some of our own ancestors, to get through the asteroid. But then when they got through, they had this empty world in the next interval of time, which is the Paleocene. And that's where these fossils demonstrate and document how mammals so quickly diversified in that world. Now, most of these mammals that were prospering during the Paleocene were placental mammals. They were ones like us that give live birth to well-developed young. Now, in today's world, there are over 6,000 species of mammals. A few of those are monotremes. These are those weird mammals, the platypus and the echidna, that only live in Australia and some of the surrounding islands. They are the only mammals that lay eggs. They are a throwback, a vestige, a survivor of this archaic group of primitive mammals that once lived all across the South during the age of dinosaurs. It's miraculous they've survived to today in this one corner of the world. They give us a glimpse of the early history of mammals. Then there's nearly 400 species of marsupials. These are the things like kangaroos and koalas and possums that give birth to tiny little babies that are so premature they have to raise them further in a pouch. And these mammals are very common in Australia and in South America, but there's none of them in Europe. They used to live here, and they used to live all over the north, but they were wiped out up north by the asteroid. And so a few survived for a while, but they trickled away. And then all the rest of modern day mammals are placental mammals, about 95% of all mammals. Ones, again, like us, that give live birth to well-developed young, like my little boy Anthony there, representing placentals. So almost all mammals that you know of, dogs and cats and bears and bats and whales and elephants and monkeys and mice and rabbits and so on, they are all placental mammals. And placental mammals became ascendant after the asteroid killed the dinosaurs. They are the mammals that primarily diversified. All of these things today are a product of that legacy of placental mammals taking over from the dinosaurs. Now, in the Paleocene period, these fossils we find in New Mexico, they are placentals. We can tell that in various ways by the shape of their hips and by details of their bones, how they grew, but they are still pretty mysterious. We don't really know where they fit on the family tree. Are they super primitive placentals that have left no living descendants, or are they early members of some of the major placental groups that survive today, like horses and bats and so on? We are trying to figure this out. We have a big team in Edinburgh where I have a lot of postdocs, a lot of students, and a lot of external colleagues like Tom in New Mexico. We're all working together to build this master family tree to understand the relationships of these first placentals. And we're doing this for the same reason that a lot of us build family trees of our own family. These family trees put evolution into context. But while the relationships of some of these mammals remain mysterious, we are learning lots about their biology and about their behaviors. We are learning so much about what these first pioneering placental mammals were like. So Ornella Bertrand, who is a postdoc in my lab now, she's one of the world experts on using CAT scans to see inside of mammal skulls, to digitally reconstruct the brains. And so what she found, and she's published this recently in this real bombshell paper in the journal Science earlier this year, is that those mammals that survived the asteroid and proliferated afterwards, those first placental mammals, they were not especially smart. You might think the mammals that outlasted the dinosaurs and set the stage for today's world, those mammals must have been really brainy. We're really brainy, so they must have been too, but no. Actually, those mammals got, after the asteroid, they got so big so fast because T-Rex was gone, Triceratops was gone. Those ecological roles were empty. Mammals rushed in to fill those roles and they ballooned in size, but they got so big so fast that the brains could not keep pace. And these mammals actually decreased their brain size relative to their body size. So these mammals, to put it bluntly, got dumber for a while in order to get bigger. And that was a real shocking revelation. Greg Funston, who's a postdoc in my lab, was just finishing up. Greg has been cutting up a lot of the bones and teeth of these mammals, and he has some really exciting work that will be published soon that uses the bone histology and also some geochemistry, that's some chemical signatures preserved in these teeth and bones, to show that these placentals really did give live birth to babies that developed for many, many months in the womb, just like us. And it was probably that, being able to sustain long pregnancies and being able to give birth to bigger babies, that allowed these mammals to get bigger after the dinosaurs died. If you can give birth to bigger babies, those babies can become bigger adults. And so that was probably the key that unlocked these mammals' ability to get bigger and bigger. So we're learning more about these Paleocene placentals, the ones that lived in the first 10 million years after the extinction. But when it comes down to it, most of these first placentals, they're just kind of weird. We don't quite know where they fit on the family tree. We can't quite tell if they're related to the modern groups. None of them can obviously and easily be classified as bats or whales or horses or monkeys. But that starts to change in the next interval of time, which is the Eocene. And this begins about 10 million years after the extinction, and it's kicked off by a big global warming spurt called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. The Earth got about 8 degrees Celsius warmer in a very short period of time. It's a real analogy to what's happening today. And not too long after that global warming spike, some amazing fossils turn up in Germany, and they turn up here. And this doesn't look like much, I think, this image. This really is a hole in the ground. It was a place where they used to mine oil from the shales. And then when the mines became unprofitable in the 70s, they were going to turn this big hole into a landfill where they would dump the rubbish from Frankfurt. And it almost happened, but it was saved at the last minute. And instead of a landfill, this area became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Why is that? Because in those oil shales are fossils, lots of stunning fossils, many of which are mammals, so well preserved because they fell into an ancient lake and were buried quickly. And they have hair and they have skin, and some of them, like this one up here, even has a baby in its belly. This one was pregnant when it died. What's important about these mammals is they are obvious to us. We can classify these things. Some of them are horses, some of them are primates. It is clear we can recognize them, but at the same time, they're still a bit primitive. These horses, for instance, are just the size of little poodles. But we're seeing more modern mammals that we can obviously and easily recognize and classify. So the world is becoming more modern, and familiar mammal groups are starting to emerge out of that primitive stock of archaic placentals that were first living after the asteroid. Later on throughout the Eocene, some of these groups started to churn out some really weird things. We start to see some bizarre, wacky mammals. And there were things like brontotheres. These were hoofed mammals with big battering ram horns on their head. Things called calicotheres. Totally extinct group. It looks like something that maybe would result if a horse and a gorilla could produce an offspring. You know, this weird kind of ponderous creature that walked on its knuckles with these really long arms and really short legs. So, you know, we would have no idea something like this ever existed if we didn't have fossils. And then things like Paraceratherium down here. These were rhinos that had no horns, but they had big, tall arms and legs that looked like Greek columns. These were the largest mammals to ever live on land. Mammals that looked like they're trying to really become dinosaurs, up to maybe about 20 tons in body weight. So in the Eocene, then, we start to see more modern mammals, and now we start to see really wacky mammals, mammals starting to proliferate and diversify in ways that are filling all kinds of ecological roles. And we start to see mammals develop wings and evolve the ability to fly. We find fossils of the very first bats, and here's one of those fossils. And very quickly in the Eocene, we see bat fossils all over the world. Bats were the first group of mammals to truly go global, and they did it, obviously, because they could fly. They could break the bonds of geography. It didn't matter if continents were separated from each other or whatever, they could fly around. So bats became the first global mammals. Another group of mammals became global too, but they did it in a very different way. These mammals started off with hooves, but they started to turn those hoofed arms and legs, hands and feet, into flippers that they could move about with in the water. And this is how whales came to be. There is a beautiful transitional sequence of fossils that show how this tiny little hoofed mammal that was the size of a baby deer, how it and its descendants got bigger and turned their hooves into flippers and so on, and streamlined their bodies and became these torpedo submarine-shaped whales that could only live in the water. So there was a period of time during the evolution of whales when whales could walk. There were walking whales, shockingly. And this whole sequence is one of the best understood major evolutionary transitions in the fossil record. So an instance of evolution taking one type of animal, a hoofed mammal that was suited for living on land, and morphing its body into something totally different so it could now live in a new environment in the water. And really, this whale story is a story of Bambi turning into Moby Dick. It is a fascinating story recorded by real fossils, including some stunning fossils. I think some of the most amazing fossils of all that you can go and see in Egypt, in the desert, at a place called Wadi al-Hatan. There are skeletons of some of these first true proper whales, but ones that still did retain remnants of their little hind legs. You can find them just on the desert surface. Remarkable, beautiful, striking, evocative fossils. And you can go see these things. And these are part of that sequence that captures in action, evolution in action, the development of whales. Now, whales continued to get bigger and bigger over time and ultimately culminated in the blue whale and the many other whales that are still alive today. But here's the famous blue whale on display at the Natural History Museum in London. I don't think we appreciate blue whales enough, if I'm honest. Blue whales are the largest animals, actually the largest organisms, period, that have ever lived in Earth history. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. These are the biggest things that have ever lived. They are alive today. We share a world with them. We breathe the same air as them. These things are the size of submarines. They give birth to babies that are the size of speedboats. They can dive thousands of feet deep. Their vocalizations resonate thousands of miles across the world's ocean, the most powerful sounds in the animal kingdom. I think that if there was an alternative world where whales were extinct and all we had were their petrified bones, I think we would hold them in as much esteem as we hold the dinosaurs. But they're still with us. Thankfully, they're still with us. So we really need to conserve them and make sure that they do not disappear. But these are stunning mammals. This is a mammal. Look at this thing. It is so big. It is so different from those ancestral mammals. It shows how far mammals have come and how much mammals have adapted and diversified. And if you doubt, for whatever reason, the size of blue whales, just look at this photo. This is a colleague of mine, Travis Park, who studies whales. There he is, posing next to the skull of a blue whale. This blue whale would treat Travis like we treat a piece of popcorn. That's how big this whale is. And they are still alive, cruising the world's oceans today. Now, the Eocene was a pretty hot time. It kind of continued what was pretty hot climates that were there during the time of dinosaurs. And meanwhile, the continents continued to move around. And really, by the end of the Eocene, the world is looking pretty modern. There's, yes, some differences. And two of the main differences are that Africa and South America are island continents. It was actually only very recently, only about 2.5 million years ago, that South America docked with North America. Africa docked with Eurasia a little bit before that. But for much of the Paleocene, the Eocene continuing onwards, South America and Africa were island continents, just like Australia. And they started to incubate some of their own very peculiar mammals. On Africa, elephants evolved, and elephants started small. They started the size of little lapdogs like Erytherium, and they supersized their bodies over time. And they eventually produce all these different species of huge mammals with all different types of tusks of different shapes and sizes. Meanwhile, in South America was basically isolated from the rest of the world for tens of millions of years. Some very weird mammals evolved there, in situ, in isolation. And some of these mammals, their bones were first noticed by indigenous people who tried to understand what they were. Later on, Charles Darwin himself, when he was sailing around South America on the Beagle, when they would drop anchor in different ports, Darwin would go inland and collect fossils of these mammals. He did not know what to make of them. They were big, a lot of them, and they seemed to have weird mashups of the features of different modern-day animal groups. They seemed like Frankenstein creatures, a little bit of rodent here, a little bit of horse there, a little bit of elephant there. He didn't know what they were. And it was only very recently, just within the last decade, that people found some DNA in some of these bones and some other soft tissues. And they put that through the whole DNA paternity test, and they determined that these things are actually close relatives of horses. They are members of the odd-toed line of hoofed mammals that include horses and rhinos and a few other species. So as weird as these things are, they're like a bizarre group of horses, basically, that got stranded in South America and evolved all kinds of quirky features. Now, the Eocene, pretty hot. Again, the climate was kind of continuing as it was from the age of dinosaurs. It was hot and it was muggy, and a lot of the world was covered in jungles. But then later on in the Eocene, and especially in the next interval of time, the Oligocene, climate started to change. The Earth started to get cooler. And this was largely because Antarctica broke free of all the other continents, and it was separated as its own island continent, another island continent, over the South Pole with a circumpolar current that really put the Earth into a freeze. This was like an air conditioner, that current. And so a lot of the jungles shrank in size and turned into more open land, and a new type of plant moved in to fill the space. These were plants that could grow fast, they could survive a lot of drought, and they could survive times of low rainfall, and they could survive swings in temperature. These are grasses. Grasses are a type of flowering plant. If you let the grass in your garden grow really tall, it will start to flower. Things like corn and wheat that we grow as crops, they are grasses. And the corn kernels, the wheat kernels, those are the fruits of that grass. But grasses are a new invention of Earth history. It seems like they originated right at the end of the Cretaceous. So most dinosaurs would have never seen a blade of grass. And then afterwards, grasses were around, but they were relegated to little patches in the forest. But then as the jungles shrank and land opened up, grasses filled in. So it was really only very late in Earth history that grasslands, savannas, prairies started to spread. And as they did so, mammals adapted. New types of mammals emerged to live in these more open areas, including things like rhinos and big horses and carnivores like dogs and cats that could pounce on their prey and chase their prey. Shockingly, these types of mammals lived all across the northern continents, including North America. And if you were around about 12 million years ago in North America, you could have gone on safari. It would have looked a lot like Africa today. There were rhinos, there were horses, there were camels, there were elephants. And we know all this because there's a famous fossil site in Nebraska where the Yellowstone volcano, the same volcano that's in operation today, it was much more potent back then. It erupted and it spread this cloud of ash that covered much of North America. And in Nebraska, this ash buried herds of camels and horses and rhinos. And this is a site called the Ashfall Fossil Beds. Stunning graveyard of fossil species. And among some of these fossils are some of the predators that evolved. These terrifying animals, hellhounds and hell pigs, and all these creatures with these hysterical names. These big, strong, nasty meat eaters that evolved to live in the open spaces to hunt those camels and horses and rhinos. That's what was happening in the northern continents during the Oligocene and especially the next interval of time called the Miocene, kind of between 20 and 10-ish million years ago. But meanwhile, down south, things were different. And Australia in particular was an island continent, and it was way on the edge of the world, really far away from all the other continents. And Australia developed its own really, really odd community of mammals. And a scientist named Mike Archer has been collecting these mammals for decades now out in the outback using explosives. He's sitting there on a box of explosives. He uses these low-grade explosives to crack open the rock and bring the rock back to his lab where he can actually put it into vinegar. And the vinegar strips away the rock and leaves only the bones. And he gets these beautiful skeletons. And these are marsupials. We basically forgotten about marsupials. I only mentioned them briefly because I've been mostly talking about placental mammals like us that give live birth to big babies. But marsupials are the ones that have the tiny babies they raise in pouches. And I mentioned marsupials used to be widespread in the north, but then went extinct. So in Europe and North America, we're not very familiar with them. There's one type of marsupial in North America, the possum, that's actually a recent immigrant from South America. But in Europe and Asia, there's no marsupials anymore. But Australia was a place, and South America, where some of those marsupials from the north were able to migrate to escape to. And then once they were on those islands of South America and Australia, these marsupials blossomed and diversified into so many different types of species. And we see that with these fossils. And these Australian fossils include the ancestors of koalas and kangaroos and wombats and all these familiar marsupials today. They also include some really stunning animals that converged, independently evolved the same types of features that a lot of placentals have. Things like big claws and saber teeth and so on. So there were marsupial lions that lived in Australia that were the top predators. So eventually, though, grasslands did come to Australia, and some of those marsupials now had to adapt to living in the open spaces. And grasslands really spread all over the world. Of course, there's still jungles in some places, but it's not, very little of the world is cloaked in jungles today. This was all because the Earth was getting cooler and cooler and cooler. Then about 2.5 million years ago, the Earth got really cold. We snapped into a deep freeze, and this was the Ice Age. And in fact, the Ice Age is a series of lots of different pulses where glaciers spread onto the land and then pulses where they draw back. Shockingly, if I was here in Edinburgh, about 20,000 years ago, there would have been like a mile of ice here. The polar ice cap had come down so far it would have covered Edinburgh. It would have covered Chicago, where I'm from. It would have covered so many of the great cities of the north. This was a time of intense cold. And technically, really, we're still in the Ice Age. We're just in an interglacial period, a time when the glaciers have retreated. Ice Age was the time of this charismatic megafauna, some of the most famous fossil mammals of all, things like woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. They lived in this Ice Age world, and their fossils are very common today because they lived so recently. You might see a woolly mammoth in a museum, and you might think of it kind of like a dinosaur, some beast from prehistory. But really, woolly mammoths lived up until just a few thousand years ago. The last one died. The woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers, they are part of this megafauna. During the Ice Age, there was a whole menagerie of magnificent mammals. There were woolly rhinoceroses. There were cave hyenas. There were American lions. There were armadillos the size of Volkswagens. There were deer with antlers the size of dinner tables. There were wombats that weighed 3 tons in Australia. There were kangaroos that were too plump to hop. In North America, there were beavers the size of humans. And my favorite of all were these enormous sloths that lived on the ground and walked on their knuckles. They were 10 feet tall. And their bones, believe it or not, were first studied and identified and discussed by Thomas Jefferson, the third American president. He studied the bones of these animals while he was the sitting vice president of the United States, which is just a stunning thing to think about in our current political climate, that a sitting vice president, and later he was president and he continued to study these bones. Incredible. He published scientific research papers on these. We knew the megafauna. These were not some abstract, extinct creatures from the depths of prehistory. These were animals we knew. Our human ancestors, our Homo sapiens ancestors, encountered these animals, observed these animals, hunted these animals, were fascinated by these animals. There are caves in France and Spain that are plastered with the first human graffiti, which is largely lots and lots of drawings of mammoths. So we knew these animals, and really, it was probably through our behavior, by hunting them, by clearing their environments, by breaking up their populations, that largely contributed to their demise. Humanity is a new feature of mammals and of Earth history. The first humans, the first apes that came down from the trees and started to walk upright on 2 legs were things like Ardipithecus that lived between 5 and 6 million years ago. And from there, a bushy family tree of humans evolved, including things like Australopithecus and the famous Lucy fossil. And later on, after these apes came down from the trees and started walking on 2 legs, their hands were free to make tools. They could eat new food. They could start eating meat. Their brains got bigger afterwards. This was the path of humanity. But the remarkable thing is, from that point that the first apes came down from the trees until only about 40,000 years ago, with the death of the Neanderthals, there were always multiple species of humans around at the same time, sometimes living together in the same environments. And that's a weird thing to think about. Different species of humans. But really, we're just a mammal. And there's different species of cats that are alive in the world today. Different species of hoofed mammals and so on. So humans were once like that. Now, our species, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa probably around 300,000 years ago. There's always new fossils that are pushing it back a little bit. But by that time, there had been many other human species that had also first emerged in Africa and then streamed out and spread around the world. So when our Homo sapiens ancestors started to migrate out of Africa, when they went into Europe and Asia, they would have met other humans. They would have encountered Neanderthals. And I think that is just a really stunning thing to think about. You're a Homo sapiens, you're coming out of Africa, you're tracking your prey, you go into Europe, you kind of encroach into Europe, you get close to the glaciers, it's cold, it's in the winter, you go into a cave to shelter yourself, you think you're safe, and then you sense something, and something flickers in the light in front of you. And you look around and you see something that looks kind of like you, but different, a little shorter, a little stockier. But something that's communicating, that probably has a language, that has jewelry on, that has makeup on its face or war paint on its face. So Homo sapiens meet your Neanderthal cousins. sapiens moved around the world. They bred with Neanderthals. They bred with other humans. We basically absorbed them into our genomes and maybe led the others to go extinct. And Homo sapiens became the one true globe-trotting human species. We spread all around the world, and then, of course, now we've gone even farther into space, and who knows how far we will go. And we have spread so much around the world, and we have affected our environment so much. We're changing the climates and the landscapes so quickly that we are putting so much pressure on our mammal cousins. We are but one species of mammal, but we are a sublime species of mammal, a remarkable species of mammal that can affect the world like no other mammal. And since humans started migrating around the world, since Homo sapiens started moving around the world, something like 350 mammals have gone extinct. That's about 5% of all mammals. Now, maybe that number sounds small, or maybe that number sounds big to you. But the point is, we've lost about 5% of mammals just because of our actions. And there are lots of mammals that are endangered today. Mammals are at the most perilous point in their history since they stared down that asteroid 66 million years ago. And what the future holds is really up to us, because we are the main reason the environment's changing so quickly. We are the main reason so many mammals are threatened. But we evolved big brains and consciousness and the ability to work together in groups. We know what we're doing to the world. We can understand it, and we can change it. So really, the future is up to us, the future of ourselves and our mammal family. But ultimately, I am optimistic in one thing. Mammals will endure. I am confident of that. Mammals have been so resilient. For 325 million years, the mammal line has weathered mass extinctions, global warming, ice ages, volcanoes, asteroids. We've gotten through all of this. So I am confident that the age of mammals will continue in one way or another, but it's really up to us humans what that will be like. So with that, I thank you very much. I thank you for the opportunity, and I hope to see many of you in person at some point. If you're ever in Edinburgh, please do let me know. So thank you very much, and cheers.